All right, we've been talking about arguments that might give us reason to believe in the existence of an immaterial soul. The kinds of arguments we've been considering so far all fall under the general rubric of inference to the best explanation. We posit, or the fans of souls posit the existence of souls so as to explain something that needs explaining about us. Now, I've gone through a series of such arguments, and the one that we ended with last time was the suggestion that we need to believe in the existence of a soul in order to explain the fact that we've got free will. The fact that we've got free will is something that most of us take for granted about ourselves. But the complaint then, or the objection to the physicalist, takes the form that we couldn't be a merely physical entity because no merely physical entity could have free will. But we've got free will, so there's got to be something more to us than just being a physical object. Now, if we push the dualist to explain what is it about free will that rules out the possibility that we are merely physical objects, I think the natural suggestion to spell out the argument goes like this, and this is where we were at the end of last time. The thought is that there's a kind of incompatibility with being free and being determined. I mean, after all, from the physicalist point of view, we're just a kind of glorified robot, able to do all sorts of things that most robots in most science fiction movies can do. But still, in a sense, we're just a glorified physical object. We're just a robot. And robots, the objection goes, are programmed. They necessarily follow their program. More generally speaking, we might say they're subject to deterministic laws. As physical objects, it's true of them that they must do what the laws of physics and laws of nature require that they do, and the laws of physics take a deterministic form. Determinism being a bit of philosopher's jargon for when it's true of these laws that, or a physical or a system, that if you set it up a certain way, cause and effect plays out such that given that initial setup, the very same effect must follow. It's determined by the laws of nature that the effect that follows will follow from that cause. And so if you rewind the tape and play it again over and over and over again, each time you set things up the very same way, they must move or transform or change or end up in the very same state. Well, that's what determinism is all about. And intuitively, it seems plausible to many people that you couldn't have free will and be subject to determinism. Because the notion of free will was that even if I was in the very same spot again, the very same situation again, I could have chosen differently. So I wasn't determined or predetermined to make that choice. So if we were to spell out the argument somewhat more fully, it might be we have free will, but you can't both have free will and be subject to determinism or subject to deterministic laws. And every physical object, or every purely physical object, is subject to deterministic laws because the laws of physics are deterministic. You put these things together and you get the conclusion that we, since we've got free will, can't be a purely physical object. There must be something more than the purely physical to us. That's the argument I put up on the board at the end of last class, and here we've got it up here now. 1, we have free will. 2, nothing subject to determinism has free will. 3, all purely physical systems are subject to determinism. So, conclusion, we are not a purely physical system. To explain the fact that we've got free will, so the objection goes, we have to posit the existence of a soul, something non-physical, something more than purely physical. Well, that's the argument, but I don't myself find the argument compelling. Now, the first thing to notice is that to get the conclusion, we need all 3 premises. Give up the conclusion that give up the premise that we've got free will, it won't follow that we're non-physical. Even if something that did have free will would have to be non-physical, wouldn't follow that we're non-physical. That's true for each one of the premises. Give it up, the conclusion doesn't go through. And the interesting thing is that each one of these premises could be plausibly challenged. Now, as I said last time, the subject of free will or free will, determinism, causation, responsibility, this cluster of problems is an extremely difficult and complicated physical problem. And we could easily devote an entire semester to discussing it. So all we're doing here is the most quick and superficial glance. But still, let me quickly point out why you could resist the argument from free will to the existence of a soul. First of all, as I just noted, the argument needs premise number one. It's got to be the case to prove that we've got a soul, at least for this argument to work, to prove that we've got a soul, it's got to be the case that we've got free will. Now, that could be challenged. There are philosophers who have said, we certainly believe that we've got free will, but it's an illusion. We don't really have free will. Indeed, why don't we have free will? For precisely the reasons that are pointed to by the rest of the argument. They might say, look, well, we're physical objects. Determinism is true of us. No physical object that's subject to determinism could have free will, so we don't have free will. Of course, we mistakenly believe we've got free will. We are physical objects that labor under the illusion that we have free will. But after all, free will isn't something that you can just see, right? You can't peer into your mind and see the fact that you've got free will. Yes, we've got the sense that we could have acted differently, but maybe that's an illusion. As I say, there are philosophers who've argued that way, have denied that we have free will, and if we do conclude that we don't actually have free will, then we no longer have this argument for the existence of a soul. It's a way to avoid the argument, although, for what it's worth, I should mention, I don't myself believe that it's false that we have free will. That is to say, I do think premise one is true. I myself think we do have free will. So, although I don't believe the argument is sound, premise one doesn't happen to be the premise I myself would want to reject. But there are two other key premises. What about premise number three? All purely physical systems are subject to determinism. Well, we need that premise as well to make the argument go. Suppose we think, look, you can't have free will and determinism. You can't combine them. The view that you can't combine them is sometimes known as incompatibilism, for the obvious reason. It's the view that these two things are incompatible. You can't have determinism and free will. Suppose we do believe in incompatibilism and believe that we've got free will. It would follow then that we're not subject to deterministic laws. Well, the dualist says that shows us that we have to believe that there's something non-physical about us. Because, after all, premise three, all purely physical systems are subject to determinism. Isn't it true, after all, that the basic laws of physics are deterministic laws? And the answer is, well, it's not so clear that it is true, which is just to say that premise three of the argument can be rejected as well. Now, at this point I have to just confess, as I've confessed at other times before, the three is a claim about empirical science. What does our best theory about the laws of nature tell us? And I'm no scientist, and I'm no specialist in sort of empirical matters, and believe me, I'm no authority on quantum mechanics, our best theory of fundamental physics. Still, I gather, here's what I'm told, that the standard interpretation of quantum mechanics says that, despite what many of us might have otherwise believed, the fundamental laws of physics are not, in fact, deterministic. What does that mean? Suppose we've got some sort of radioactive atom which has a certain chance of decaying. What does that mean? Well, it means that, there's maybe, let's say, an 80% chance that in the next 24 hours it will break down. 80% of atoms that are set up like that break down in the next 24 hours. 20% of them don't. Now, according to quantum mechanics, on the standard interpretation, that's all there is to say about it. You have an atom like that, 80% chance in the next 24 hours it will break down. Suppose it does break down. Can we say why it broke down? Sure, we can say, well, after all, there was an 80% chance that it would. Take an atom that after 24 hours hasn't broken down. Can we say why it hasn't broken down? Sure, there was a 20% chance that it wouldn't. Can we explain why the ones that do break down, and the ones that don't break down? No. All we can say is there was an 80% chance it would, 20% chance it wouldn't, so most of them do, some of them don't. That's as deep as the explanation goes. There's nothing more. Now, when we've got our deterministic hats on, we think to ourselves, there's got to be some underlying causal explanation, some feature about the breakdown atoms that explain why they broke down, that was missing from the non-breakdown atoms that explain why they don't break down. After all, determinism, right? If you set up the atoms exactly the same way, they've always got to break down. But the answer is, according to the standard interpretation of quantum mechanics, that's not how it works. All there is to say is, some of these are going to break down, and some of these won't. The fundamental laws of physics, according to the standard interpretation of quantum mechanics, are probabilistic. Determinism is not true at the level of fundamental physics. No, that's what I'm told. Believe me, I'm in no position to say, but that's what I'm told. And of course, if that's true, then premise 3 is false. It just isn't true that all purely physical systems are subject to determinism. So even if it does turn out that you can't have free will and determinism, that doesn't rule out the possibility that we are purely physical objects, because not all purely physical systems are subject to determinism. If determinism isn't true of us at the fundamental level, then even if you couldn't both have determinism and free will, we could still have free will, and yet for all that still be purely physical systems. While I'm busy pointing out ways in which the argument doesn't succeed, I also want to just take a moment and mention that premise 2 is also subject to criticism. Premise 2 was the incompatibilist claim that nothing subject to determinism has free will. You can't combine them. They're incompatible. Now, incompatibilism, I take it, is probably something like the common sense view here. It's the view that probably most of you believe, but again, it's worth noting that philosophically it can be challenged. There are philosophers, and here I'll tip my hat and say I'm one of them, there are philosophers who believe that in fact the idea of free will is not incompatible with determinism. So even if determinism were true of us, that wouldn't rule out our having free will, because you can, appearances to the contrary notwithstanding, have both determinism and free will. They're compatible. Hence, this view is known as compatibilism. If we accept compatibilism, we'll be able to say, look, maybe we have free will and determinism is true of us, but for all that, we're still just purely physical systems. Even if quantum mechanics was wrong and somehow, at the macro level, all the indeterminism boils out, whatever, and at the macro level we are deterministic systems, so what? If a deterministic system could nonetheless have free will, we could still be purely physical systems. Now, mind you, I haven't said anything today to convince you of the truth of compatibilism, nor am I going to try to do that. My point here was only to say we shouldn't be so quick to think that we have to believe in the existence of a soul in order to explain our having free will. It takes all of the premises of the argument to get the conclusion that the soul exists, and each one of the premises can be challenged. And here I mean not merely Well, logically speaking, of course you can reject any premise of any argument. No, I mean there are reasonable philosophical or scientific grounds for worrying about each one of the premises. The argument requires a lot. That doesn't prove that the argument fails, but it does mean that you're going to have your work cut out for you if you're going to use this route to arguing for the existence of a soul.